one of the strangest things in my life. It seems to be this undescribable separation of people working in music education and people working in music. And we're all educating in music, and we're all involved with music education. And a lot of people in music don't know the fantastic work that's going on in music education. And I've known Martin Fautley's work for years and years and years. And Birmingham City University has been doing absolutely amazing stuff for a long time. And I would say normal music departments haven't got a clue about this. And these are the people that are doing the revolutionary stuff and bringing music to new audiences. So I'm very much looking forward to your talk and learning about what I should have learned about a long time ago.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity to share our Project Music Maze with you. I'm Nancy Evans, and my role at Birmingham Contemporary Music Group is I'm the Director of Learning, so I'm in charge of all the sort of outreach activity of the organisation. So most of my work is about new music and new audiences and new participants. And I'm with here today. I'm with my two colleagues from Birmingham City University.
So I'm Martin Fautley, as Lee said. I'm Professor of Education at Birmingham City University.
And I'm Victoria Kinsella. I'm a Senior Research Fellow and I work alongside Martin at the University.
And so today we're going to be talking about one particular project called Music Maze, which was the subject of an actual research project we did together as far back as 2013, but we're still kind of mining our research for more things to share. So in orchestral education, the repertoire project has been a staple kind of project that you do with young people. And it's also, in terms of the GCSE and A-level curriculum in this country, often composition activity is stimulated by set works. But I felt very much that these repertoire projects were very underthought about, under-evaluated. There was just an assumption that that's what you did as orchestral education. And that's why I invited Martin and Victoria to work with me to unpick some of the practice around that. Yeah. So I think the repertoire projects happen on a bit of a spectrum. I think when they first started, they were very, very much about audiences of the future. In crude terms, bums on seats. But I think things have moved on significantly there. So other reasons for doing repertoire projects, preparation for listening to a piece in a concert, and that might be using very simplified elements of a piece of music and making with a group of children, recreating that piece using simple elements. Or it might be using very basic starting points. I always had a bit of a bugbear that repertoire projects could be as basic as, okay, Debussy has written La Mer, let's do a piece about the sea. And the connection with the music was very, very tenuous. Or there's the kind of pastiche approach, which is what we see in the UK in the curriculum quite a lot. I was really, Music Maze more and more has become about young people, children, particularly as composers, and it's become more about how do we take the processes and the thinking of the composers that we perform on our main concert stage, and how do we share those processes and ways of thinking with young people to support their own development as young composers. A really quick introduction to Music Maze. It's one of the oldest projects. I've been working at BCMG now, I think, 18 years, which is slightly terrifying. I think it's one of the first projects because I wanted to really connect with the repertoire of the organisation. So about once a month, about 25 young people, aged 8 to 11, come to the CBSO Centre, and we spend the day from 10 till 2 o'clock using ideas from repertoire in upcoming BCMG concerts as a stimulus for their composing, and then at 2 o'clock we perform these pieces to their family and to their friends. Some of the children, I would say about a third of the children play instruments, and that can be from absolute beginners to a grade 5 cellist. As some come every single time, and some children might just come 2 or 3 times a year. So it's a very, very varied group. And some of the young people may have additional needs as well. And I run the project, and I work with 2 BCMG musicians each time. That's different musicians each time. And also with our learning trainee, which is a 1-year traineeship that we run, a paid traineeship for somebody to get experience of practical running of projects, but also the administration behind these kinds of projects. So why use contemporary repertoire? I do think ownership and children's own creative ideas is absolutely fundamental to their composing. But I think for all of us, if children were just left alone, only composing with their own resources, it could become quite narrow. So one of the ideas of using contemporary music is it opens out a whole range of different approaches to composing. It takes away that blank page, which we all know could be quite terrifying. I also think contemporary music is just full of games and codes and systems, all of which are really fun ways to stimulate composing. I think another important part of it is to show young people that composers and composing is really diverse. There's not one approach which they might experience in their schools. This is how you compose, and it can be quite a painting by numbers approach. And I think it connects them to the world of contemporary composers, what's really going on, how are professional composers working, and again, connects them as a living contemporary culture rather than seeing composers and composing as something historical. And I think something that was touched upon earlier was about playfulness, and that what part of it is explaining to children that they're doing the same thing as composers. They're being playful with sound, just in a different kind of way, maybe with less sophisticated material than professional composers. So it's that connection. It was really interesting. I gave a similar presentation last year at Nordic Music Days at the South Bank, and someone also pointed out another motivation, which is actually far more personal, which I hadn't really I probably should have thought about much more, was that for me, it challenged me from doing the same kinds of workshops over and over again, reproducing my own practice. So I get a huge amount out of having to research other composers' approaches, and that expands my practice as a workshop leader too. Now, so when we're planning these workshops with contemporary music, what do we have to go on? We have quite limited materials, really. We don't have years of different kinds of recordings. We have the scores. We have maybe a few recordings if you're lucky, some program notes, and if I'm lucky, maybe there's an email conversation with the commissioned composer. And then also with more slightly older composers, maybe there is literature written about the composers and the piece. And so this became the subject of a research project in 2013. I invited Martin and Victoria, and here are some of the questions that we were thinking about.
It's really important, I think, that I explain that one of the things that we did in our role was to research practice, but also philosophy. And one of the ways that we did this was that we would observe a session, and then immediately afterwards, maybe contrary to a lot of research practice, we would take Nancy away and then bombard her with really difficult questions. Like, why did you do this? What was the point of that activity? Why did this happen? And it was those in-the-moment research questions that often led to us gaining some really in-depth insights into what's happened. And what we want to do now is to talk about one of those really in-depth insights that arose from some of this work.
Okay, so as Nancy and Martin just said, what we tried to do is we tried to unpick not only the composing processes of the children, but also Nancy and the team's kind of pedagogical approaches as well. And we know that a musical learning environment has to account for different identities, modes of learning, and pedagogical processes. So for us to understand this kind of multifaceted reality, we thought that a socio-cultural perspective would be really helpful. One that particularly embraces individuality, but also credits interconnections between people. So Vygotsky's notion of the zone of proximal development acknowledges activity as a transitional process from between people to then being internalised by an individual. And Vygotsky furthered this theory of learning, maintaining that individual learning processes are mediated by what he calls cultural artefacts that then affects an outcome. And these can be either physical or psychological artefacts that facilitate action. So in musical interactions, for example, this could be a musical instrument, or in other forms it could be a mediating artefact, could be the types of questioning that you're asking and discussion. In the diagram on the board, you'll see Vygotsky's model of mediated action. And in this diagram, the subject is the individual who interacts with a mediating artefact, enabling him or her to arrive at the object, which is the outcome of learning. And key to this is that the artefact is the central component that becomes the stimulus that affects practice. Now, Engerstrom sees the study of mediating artefacts and actions as important to understanding human action. However, he felt that Vygotsky's model was not really considering the wider kind of socio-cultural aspects of the learning environment. So Engerstrom extends Vygotsky's model and encompasses both individual and group action in a collective and interactive activity system, where, as you can see at the bottom of this diagram here, the rules, community and division in labour are also explored. And this, Engerstrom believes, gives a more holistic understanding of a learning environment. Now, that is quite complicated, so hopefully I'm going to try and unpick this in terms of Music Maze. So what did this look like in Music Maze? Well, as you can see, in the upper portion of the triangle represents the relationships between the subjects, in this case BCMG musicians, the young people, and the mediating artefact, which in this case for Music Maze is the repertoire, and the object, which is the composed piece by the children, then leading to a performed composition. But also important in Music Maze was for us to consider also the community node, which involves all of those involved in a session, which includes not only those in the activity, but also BCMG as an organisation. Parents, for example, parents are a huge part of this learning community. Also, another aspect that we were considering was the divisions of labour. And in this section, we needed to investigate what composedly thinking, learning and doing looked like and how it was undertaken. So this involves various interactions between people, but also on an individual level as well. So divisions of labour could include peer-to-peer interaction, collaboration with BCMG musicians, and also people like Nancy who are leading the sessions. And then the extension of the socio-cultural environment is also extended in the rules aspect. And particularly for Music Maze, the rules of the session were defined by the repertoire and how that was planned by Nancy and her team in terms of how it was enacted in Music Maze. Now we're going to unpick this a little bit further because we use this activity theory system as a way to analyse the learning that was going on within the sessions and composing processes. So one particular aspect that was really important for us to look at was the divisions of labour in a Music Maze session. Who is doing what and what are their roles in the Music Maze session? And I'm going to pass over to Nancy to explain a little bit further about those roles.
So my role in Music Maze is to design the workshop, and I do this with the learning trainee because it's a real training opportunity of sharing how the practice of planning a workshop. And then at 9:30, just before the workshop, we go through this with the rest of the team. And throughout the day, my responsibility is the bigger structure of the workshop. And then throughout the day, there are opportunities for the young people to work as individuals, in pairs, and often with the BCMG musicians responsible for a small group, say of 6 to 8 musicians, or a small group which is comprised of each of those working as individuals or in pairs. And then throughout the day there's opportunities for us to share back what we've done. But a really important change, I guess, that happened through doing this project was making those opportunities for individual progression, which I think can be quite different from other projects I've witnessed where a lot of the leadership is done by the musicians and where they're making a lot of decisions for the young people. So it's really important to make sure throughout there's opportunities for every single child in the workshop to be doing the composerly thinking, but then also opportunities for that to be shared so that all the children are benefiting from each other's knowledge, which takes us back to that community.
Exactly, which is the next kind of section that we were kind of thinking about in terms of music maze. And I think a really important part of exploring and analysing music maze was thinking about this concept that we have in the bottom here, composing with, not composing on. And that was a really kind of huge part of exploring music maze. And also this notion of distributed cognition, that it is shared between the members of the groups. And Nancy again is going to kind of explain how that was enacted.
So the young people might, I think I've sort of said, maybe I've said it sort of already, have I? Beg people speak?
Okay.
Yeah, I think I sort of said it already, yes. Yeah,
Okay, so the repertoire was a huge part of Music Maze, and that became what we would call like the mediating artefact in terms of it was the main part that we were exploring in terms of how Music Maze was then enacted.
Yeah, so we can take a bit of an example in the next slide. So we don't shy away from what might be called challenging music. Over the last year, we've looked at works by Elliot Carter, Harrison Birtwistle, Jorg Widmann. Whatever's going on in the ensembles playing, that's what we're looking at. Last year, we used a piece by Øyvind Torvund called Neon Forest Space. And just to sort of, why did I pick this particular piece? Well, but in each workshop I try and choose both musical stimulus but also more poetic, imaginative stimulus. I find that some young people gravitate more towards the musical stimuluses and some enjoy that more poetic approach. So first of all, the piece has a great imaginative title. It was very different from music that I think the children have ever encountered before. It was a lovely collection of miniatures, 7 short movements, and immediately you start thinking about how you can structure the group into 7 small groups, each explore the ideas within each movement. It contained a mixture of found sounds, found music, and instruments. It used extended techniques, also used different objects as well, and we used samples. And the melodic material that it used was quite simple, and there was a lot of use of drones. So these were all things that I felt the children could access. So you can read further on how that worked. Also really important, as well as when in terms of the planning of the workshops, the big change that the project helped me with was I did an awful lot of planning for the doing rather than the actual learning. And so in terms of the planning process, you know, what do we want the children to learn? What is it about this particular piece of repertoire? What does it offer to the children's learning? And also I think when you talk about the composing on and the BCMG musician over-leading the session and telling the children basically what to do, then there was an opportunity that children could get lost in that process. So you know, if you're working in a group of 6 and you're only going with the ideas of that child who's always got the hand up, not everybody is getting the same experience. So really thinking about how we differentiate with different abilities, how we simplify approaches where necessary. Also just planning what questions we ask. Other projects that we've done together, we've realised how important the kinds of questions that we ask and the feedback that we give. And then you can read some of those other ones later on. I think we need to move a little bit on. So some of the issues that we've encountered when composing with young people. I think a lot of young people think is you draw a treble clef and then off you go, and it's a very linear process. To trying to break them out of that habit. I think in these kind of projects there's an awful lot of energy given to generating the ideas, but very little to actually how you might develop those ideas and structure those ideas. We found that what I thought was an idea was quite different from what the children thought was an idea. We discovered that how children compose is quite different how we might compose as adults. Of course, there's the whole thing in terms of the music that some of these young people play, very dominated by melodic material, so getting them to think in terms of sound rather than just melody is very important. There's a huge debate around notation. Whether is it composing or is it writing music? And I think still we really don't know enough about how children compose and how they progress as composers. And all the time we're asking them to compose in groups.
So part of our role at the university and with Nancy was really thinking about this role of activity theory, and what it helped us to start to do was deconstruct the composing process. And we really think that this is kind of a methodology that actually working together from now on, we're going to really think about the kind of wider aspects of pedagogical processes and the development of composing together. So really thinking about the rules, the community, and also the divisions of labour that occur within sessions, within music maze. So hopefully that we really start to thoroughly unpick, but also start to theorise the work that's been done in music maze.
And moving swiftly on to think about the key findings, my colleagues have already talked about the difference between doing and learning. And when you've watched a lot of composing projects, you've seen a lot of doing. How much learning have you seen? And who has been doing the learning? There's a whole raft of questions about that. We've watched a lot of composing projects that are about putting on the final concert. And the whole thing is geared, right, okay, we've got a concert in 3 weeks' time. What about the process of composing? How do we get to that stage? The kids, what's their ownership of it? What happens to it? How does it done? What about this question of ownership versus composing? Own creativity of workshop leaders, musicians, versus the children's creativity. We've seen a lot of projects where, as we've used the phrase composing on the children. We have sometimes not seen composing with the children. We've seen composing on them. There's an awful lot that is going on. And so these are the key findings that we've talked about and that we've thought about and talked about with Nancy. I don't know if you want to add anything to the key findings in the 90 seconds or so we have.
I think you've said most of it.
So, to finish with, we want to address some of the conference themes, and again, as good academics, what we want to do is problematise everything. So what do we mean by audience? And then who are we? Now there's a question that I think we need to think about. What about young people feeling that they own the process of composing? Trying to get into the minds of composers. We talk about composerly thinking, what happens? And what about children connecting in a richer fashion? Nancy's already used the bums on seats phrase. What about rich connection? And then children listening differently and not merely being passive. Thank you.
Absolutely excellent. And before I go to questions, I have erred for the second time this morning because I did half an intro because I was trying to save time. I should say, especially for those not from Great Britain, the Birmingham Contemporary Music Group is one of the finest ensembles in the country. And every ensemble in the country does have to do outreach work. It's just part of how our arts councils work. But the BCMG doesn't do it because it's something they have to do. They do it because it's something they want to do, and they've been doing absolutely excellent and world-class work. And if you've been doing it for 18 years now, so my hat's off to you. Because it isn't easy. I used to work on a campus very briefly that had the opera company come in every summer and do work on kids. And they sang musicals from the West End, also known as Broadway. So were they getting them up for opera? I don't think so. They were just giving them a musical experience. and half of the points raised just were not there. And I don't know how much money that cost. Whereas this is tangible, it's visionary. That's what this conference is about. Who would like to ask him a question about the name?
Nancy, can you tell me a little bit more about how you deal with this group of 25 children at different ages? Are they always together in one room? Do they split up?
Yeah, we start off together, and we'll do some warm-ups, some of which just welcome everybody to be familiarised, but then some are connected to the activity that we'll do later on. And maybe there's a bit of modelling and a bit of demonstration, and then those young people will go off to work in small groups. And as I sort of said, there might be 3 smaller groups, or it might be 3 adults looking after a group of individuals or a group of pairs. And they will then work, and then there'll be opportunities to share back. Maybe they might be doing sharing back in their smaller groups, or maybe they might come back into the whole group and share that. And depending on the activity that we're doing, sometimes there might be another layer of complexity added throughout the day. Or, as was the case on Sunday, they all seemed to be really working and they were self-generating the next steps, really, so there wasn't a need for more intervention. We had some backup interventions that we might have done, but it was working well, so we just sort of let it flow. And then there's always a sort of rehearsal and a kind of refining moment after lunch before we perform it.
And these groups, they stay in the same room?
Yes. Yes, and in terms of how we do that, it might be determined by the piece. So if the piece, for example, makes a big deal about having the brass working together, the wind working together, the strings working together, so we might use something from the piece as the way to divide the groups. It might be to do with friendships, people we know don't work well together, and so practicalities as well. Or, unusually we did one inspired by Debussy, and we were taking the trios, so we had everybody working in 3s because it was all about trios. So each BCMG musician looked after 2 trios. So it's determined by lots of different things. But they do tend to stay in the same ones throughout the day. And I think, again, that's a change from how we might have done it previously. But they stay in the same group, but making sure there's opportunities for them to hear from the other groups, so they're being enriched by each other's experiences as well.
Okay.
Yes?
Could you go back 2 slides? Just you went so quickly, and I wanted to take a picture because they were there. That's perfect. Another question. It's a one-day experience.
Yes.
Do some of the kids come back again? Or
Yes.
repeat experiences?
I would say that most children come probably the highest proportion come about 3 or 4 times across a year. Maybe, I can't remember, I have actually worked this out at some point. There's a group who only come once, and then there's a group that come to almost every single one. Probably divide that into sort of thirds. And there are children who have been with us since 8 years old, and then they've progressed to our older group, which is called Zigzag Ensemble, where they work as an ensemble exploring repertoire, and then as our older group called Creative Composing Lab, and they compose for our BCMG musicians rather than from each other. So, and some of those children have gone through the whole of that process.
I wasn't joking when I said they take it seriously. It's amazing.
People can look at the programme and think, you're doing the same projects for years and years and years. But I've always felt it's about programmes and not projects, and about really making a connection with the young people over time, and really refining. I think we're never going to be able to do hundreds of projects with hundreds of children. We just don't have that capacity. But what we can do is really refine our practice and develop models that can be shared. That's been the sort of approach.
Anybody else? Yes.
Yeah, talking about the models to be shared, did you think about something like guidelines of how people could take your experience and reproduce that?
Sorry, say that
somewhere
again.
else?
What are the elderly?
Yeah, again, I've felt that there's a need to sort of just focus our attention in one area. And there are I know organisations who work fantastically with older people, and at the moment I think it's a capacity issue. We have done music mazes for adults and things like that, but
I don't know, I was
Oh,
looking.
Ron.
We're actually in the process of writing
Oh,
a
yeah.
book about music maze and about the approaches to music maze, as well as kind of practicalities, but the literature kind of behind it, and also kind of theorising music maze as well. So that's kind of forthcoming. So so hopefully next time we might be in the same room as you all, we might have something more to share on that.
And I think it's important that we think about not only practice but philosophy and theory as well. And there's an awful lot of work to be done in all three areas, because otherwise I worry that there's a danger that we just keep reinventing. We don't keep reinvent the wheel, we just reinvent the same wheel. And I think we need to think about moving the wheel, not just reinventing it. Yeah.
You can find resources for teachers on this website, which take some of the workshops, and they've sort of written them up with examples from the young people, examples from our players.
Absolutely excellent. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.